Hello Wargamers and welcome to Let's Get Critical. My name is Gar. In this video I'll be showing you how we painted the brand new Kill Team Ravenors, which was released with the Typhon box set. These critically quick painting guides have been designed to show you the colours we chose, the techniques we used when painting our models for the battle reports on our channel. And if you'd like to see how we achieve this look for our Kill Team Ravenors, then please sit back, relax, and let's get painting. Now the first colour that I used was a Citadel spray colour and it's called White Scar. Normally I would use a brush to prime my models, but because I had so much to get primed, I decided to buy some spray and do all the Tyranids and the terrain all in one go. It was a lovely hot summer's day, there was a heat wave on the go, and this is the finished model after it had been primed. Now it's time to begin painting, and the first colours coming up next. The colour I'll be using is a Citadel shade colour called Agrax Earthshade. And for the brush, I'll be using a medium shade brush from Citadel. Now the first thing I decided to do was to paint the base. I didn't want to leave it to last because it seems really awkward to get around, so I made the decision now to paint it first and then get it out of the way. I just started to apply the Agrax Earthshade very carefully all around the parts of the base and the model, and I did my very best to avoid getting the shade paint onto the tail of the model. You can see here what it looks like when it's dry. I then moved on to the next shade paint, and the next shade I'll be using is called Berserker Bloodshade. I followed the same steps as in the previous section. I went over all of the parts of the base we painted earlier. Again, it was very careful not to get any of the paint onto the tail of the model. I gave the base a very generous coat of the Berserker Bloodshade like I did with the Agrax Earthshade, and then I let the model go bone dry before I moved on to the next step. The next colour I'll be using on the base is Abaddon Black, and I'll be using an old regiment brush from the army painter to quickly go around the rim of the base. I normally do this last, but as I was doing the base first on this model, I thought I'd get it done now before it was time to move on and start fully painting the rest of the model. The next colour I'll be using before I begin painting properly is White Scar, and I'll be using the character brush from the army painter. Now that the base was fully dry, I just needed to touch up all of the parts where the shade paints had gone onto the model, and using the White Scar paint I gave these areas 2 coats of the paint before moving on. Hopefully you can see here how hard it would have been to paint the base properly if I'd left it until last. But here's the model now, and this is what it looks like after the base was finished. Now it's time to add some proper colour and let the fun begin. The next colour I'll be using is a Citadel base paint, and it's called Fulgrim Pink, and for the brush I'll be using a medium dry brush from Citadel. For the first painting step, I'm going to do a dry brush all over the fleshy parts of this model. The first thing I do is to apply a really small amount of paint onto the end of the brush like this, and then you need to work the paint into the bristles of the brush. Here I'm using a palette that I picked up from the local hobby store. It's great for this sort of work. And next you need to get a piece of kitchen towel, and you need to remove most of the paint off the bristles like I'm doing now. Essentially you're left with a brush that's got relatively big bristles and it's got very little paint on them like you see here. The next thing you need to do is to start gently flicking that brush over the areas that you want to dry brush the colour. Here you can see I'm concentrating on dry brushing over the flashy areas on the Ravenor. The detail on these areas is absolutely brilliant, and the Fulgrim Pink colour is really making all those alien details stand out. And then after a while you'll need to reload the brush with more paint so you can carry on, and you just follow the same steps as before, and then you just keep going with the dry brushing. Now this model is getting quite a heavy dry brush. For a highlight dry brush you'd spend a bit more time removing excess paint from the bristles of the brush, but as I want this pink to be very noticeable and to stand out, I'm only wiping a little bit of the paint off the bulk of the paint. Now, once all the dry brushing had been completed, this is what the model looks like. I'm happy with it here, so it's time to move on to the next color. The next color I'll be using is a Citadel layer paint called Pink Horror, and for the brush I'll be using an old worn out regiment brush from the Army Painter. In this section I'll be doing some stippling with the new color onto the model, and stippling is a technique that involves dabbing the paint onto the areas to give it like a partially covered, almost like a randomized effect. I use it to add a variety of different colors and to try and stop the models looking dull and boring. Now, when stippling, it's very similar to dry brushing. You need to add just a small amount of paint onto the end of the brush. You then work the paint into the bristles using your palette, and then you remove some of the excess, and then you just start dabbing it onto the model. I'm aiming the brush at the areas where the carapace meets the flesh, and I'm trying to stipple on about a 50-50 coverage. So essentially you still see some of the Fulgrim Pink color underneath, and I'm not too fussed or concerned if I get paint onto the carapace because I'll be painting over this later. Here's what the model looks like after stippling on the Pink Horror. I'm happy with it at this point, so it's now time to move on to the next color. The next color I'll be using is a Citadel base paint called Naggaroth Night, and for the brush I'll be using an old regiment brush from the Army Painter. For this part, this section, I'll be stippling again. This time I want to stipple over the carapace sections, the armor sections, and I want to build up the color till it's about a 90-95% coverage. The reason I'm stippling here instead of just painting it on normally is because when it comes to shading the model later on in the video, I'll get a much better effect if the paint's been stippled. Painting it on normally and then shading it will lead to the color looking kind of flat and dull. Now, after I had done the large carapace armor on the back of the model, I switched to the character brush from the Army Painter to work on some of the smaller parts. And when stippling on this color, I needed to be much more careful about getting it onto the flesh. I wanted to try my very best to keep the paint on the carapace parts like you can see here. Once I was happy with how the model looked, it was then time to move on and get working on the next color. The next colour I'll be using is a Citadel contrast wash, and it's called Magos Purple, and for the brush I'll be using a medium Citadel shade brush. Now for this contrast wash I decided to thin down some Magos Purple, so I had a small tub of the Magos Purple which I poured into an empty bottle, and then I got some more of the contrast medium, and then I poured that into the bottle as well, and this essentially made a 50-50 mix, and this is the contrast wash that I used on the model. Here you can see it here. Now when you're applying a contrast wash, it's very quick and it's very easy. All I did was load the brush with the paint and then just began smearing it over the areas that I dry brushed with the and stippled with the Fulgrim Pink and the Pink Horror earlier in the video. You don't have to be too careful when applying a wash like this, but I would only recommend that you use an older brush because I find that the contrast paints are a little bit harsh and destructive to natural hair bristles. The contrast wash does a fantastic job in adding a rich and a vibrant colour to the model, but it also lets the colours underneath show through. As you can see here, you can see the two pink colours that we put on earlier, the Fulgrim Pink, and you can see the Pink Horror, and it's already, got a fantastically alien look to it. Here's what the model looks like now, and now it's time to move on to the next colour. For the next colour, I'll be using another Citadel colour. It's a base colour called Daemonette Hide, and for the brush, I'll be using the old worn out regiment brush from the Army Painter. Now I'm going to very quickly just stipple on another colour. This is another purple colour which will be going over the purple colour that we've just used before in the final stipple. But I'm doing this to add variation, and it'll hopefully, you know, help to make the model look more alien-like and break it up. Now it's exactly the same process as before. I just stipple the paint on very gently and very quickly, going over all of the carapace armour and doing my best not to touch the flesh. And this step literally just took a couple of minutes to get finished. Now once I was happy with how it looked, this is what the model looks like now, and then again it's on to the next colour. For the next colour I'll be using a Citadel colour shade paint, and it's called Berserker Bloodshade. And for the brush, again I'll be using the old worn out trusty regiment brush from the Army Painter. Now that the contrast wash is completely dried and the stippling's dried, I just wanted to add a wash all over the carapace sections that we painted purple and then we stippled purple earlier. Now applying the wash is just as easy as with all the other washes, but I obviously needed to be very, very careful where the carapace meets the flesh. I wanted a very small amount of the shade to add sort of like a reddish gradient to the fleshy parts of the model, but I did not want it to spill over and then ruin the whole effect, so I had to be very careful. This was another quick step and it only took a few minutes, but as with all shading, it does take quite a while to dry, and it's best to let it go completely dry until you do anything else. Now, this is what it looked like when it was dry, and as per normal, it's now on to the next colour. Now the next colour is one we've used earlier. It's the Fulgrim Pink colour, and for the brush I'll be using the small dry brush from the Army Painter. In this section I want to be doing another dry brush of the fleshy parts of the model, but this time I'll be using a smaller brush and I'll only be doing a highlight dry brush, and it's the same process as before. You just load some of the paint onto the brush. You then use the palette to work it into the bristles, and then you wipe off the excess onto the kitchen roll. This time, when I'm applying the dry brush, I want to be much more careful and just very, very gently flick it over the areas that we dry brushed earlier. I certainly, you know, like I say, don't want to get it onto the stipple parts with the pink horror, and I definitely don't want to get it on the parts of the model that we painted purple and then obviously washed with the Berserker Bloodshade, the carapace armour. Now a highlight dry brush is a very effective way of bringing out the details on a model, and it's all very, very quick. And this whole model took about 5 minutes. And then once the paint had dried, I just moved on to the next section, which is the Berserker Bloodshade. I'm using the old worn out regiment brush like I do quite often when I'm shading. And for this section, I wanted to just very quickly go over the joints on the model to give them like a reddish blood effect and to break away from the pink. I did this area here around the elbow, and then I moved my way up here to the wrist joints here at the top where the wrists attach to these huge kind of claw-like talons. And then I did the same on all of the arms on the model. This is what the model looks like after I'd done a highlight dry brush of the Fulgrim Pink and then shaded the joint areas with the Berserker Bloodshade. And as always, it's now time to move on to the next colour. For the next colour, I'll be using a Citadel base paint, and it's called Wraithbone. And the brush I'll be using is the character brush from the Army Painter. Now that all the kind of dry brushing and shading is out the way, I wanted to move on and do some proper painting on this model, and I decided to get out the wet palette, which I think is much better for painting. In this section, I'm going to paint all of the claws and the talons on this model. Now, using the wet palette allows you to keep the paints at a really, really nice consistency. The problem though is that they're generally quite opaque and thin, and you need to give them a couple of coats. Now, just like with most detail painting, you only want to add a small amount of paint to the tip of the brush, and then you want to carefully just use small strokes and apply the paint bit by bit until you're happy and you've given the area you're covering a full coverage, and you're just perfectly happy. After they were painted, I let them go bone dry, and then I went over the areas again to give them a second coat, and here's what the model looks like when they're finished, and time to move on to the next colour. For the next colour, it's another shade paint. It's a shade paint by Citadel called Seraphim Sepia, and the brush I'll be using again is a trusty old worn regiment brush from the Army Painter. This is another really quick step. I quickly gave the claws and the talons a coat of the sepia wash. This helps to add definition, and I think it really makes the Wraithbone look kind of grungy and dirty. Now, when applying shade paints, like I said earlier, you have to give them a liberal coat of the paint, and then you want to keep moving the paint around and don't give them time to pool. If the shade paint forms large puddles, then these can spoil the model when they dry. So I always spend a couple of minutes at the end just going round over the areas with the brush just to make sure that there are no puddles of paint left in the recesses. Here's what the model looks like at the end, and when the sepia had dried, and now it's time to move on to the final few colours. The next colour that I'll be using is back to the pink horror, and for the brush I'll be using the character brush from the Army Painter. What I decided to do is I decided to paint a few details on this model's head. The first piece I painted was this crest on his head. He has this big massive kind of crown carapace, and I thought this colour would help to set it off, and it looks better than the fleshy pink colour that was left there. And then I decided to paint these pieces on his jaw next to his mouth. After they were painted, I just moved straight on to the final colour, and the final colour I'll be using is a Citadel base colour, and it's called Bugmans Glow. Now, this is another super quick step. I used this colour to paint the long serpent-like tongue that he has sticking out of his mouth, and then once that was dry, I'm calling this model more or less finished. Now, I've had a great time painting this model, and I've also had a great time painting the rest of the Tyranid models in the Typhon box set. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to leave you with an outro video showing off the rest of the Kill Team Ravenors. My name is Gar. Thanks for watching Let's Get Critical. Bye bye.